Children's Storytime, presented by BMGFly. Assalamu alaikum. That means peace be unto you. Today we are reading The Boy Who Didn't Believe in Spring by Lucille Clifton. Pictures by Brinton Turkle. Read to you by Nia Malika Dixon. Today we are reading The Boy Who Didn't Believe in Spring by Lucille Clifton. Pictures by Brinton Turkle. Once upon a time, there was a little boy named King Shabazz who didn't believe in spring. No such thing, he'd whisper every time the teacher talked about spring in school. See her book with the flowers on it? Definitely talking about spring. Where is it at? He would holler every time his mama talked about spring at home. He used to sit with his friend Tony Polito on the bottom step when the days started getting longer and warmer and talk about it. Everybody talking about spring, he would say to Tony. Big deal, Tony would say back. No such thing, he would say to Tony. Right, Tony would say back. One day, after the teacher had been talking about birds that were blue, and his mama had started talking about crops coming up, King Shabazz decided he had just had enough. He put his jacket on and his shades and went by for Tony Polito. Look here, man, King said when they got out to the bottom step. I'm going to get me some of this spring. What you mean, man? Tony asked him. Everybody's talking about spring coming and spring just around the corner. I'm going to go around there and see what I do see. Tony Polito watched King Shabazz get up and push his shades up tight on his nose. You coming with me, man? He said while he was pushing. Tony Polito thought about it for a minute. Then he got up and turned his cap around backwards. Right, Tony Polito said back. They're on their way. Let's see what they find out. King Shabazz and Tony Polito had been around the corner before, but only as far as the streetlight alone. They passed the school and the playground. Now this is definitely about to be an adventure. Look at that. Ain't no spring in there, said King Shabazz with a laugh. Sure ain't, agreed Tony Polito. They passed Weissman's. They stopped for a minute by the side door at Weissman's and smelled the buns. Fresh baked bread smells so delicious. But he's right. There's no spring in there. Sure do smell good, whispered Tony. But it ain't spring, King was quick to answer. They passed the apartments and walked fast in case they met Junior Williams. He had said in school that he was going to beat them both up. Then they were at the street light. Tony stopped and made believe his sneaker was untied to see what King was going to do. They stood there for 2 light turns, and then King Shabazz grinned at Tony Polito, and he grinned back. And the 2 boys ran across the street. Well, if we find it, it ought to be now, said King. Here they go. Here they go. Tony didn't say anything. He just stood looking around. Well, come on, man, King whispered, and they started down the street. They passed the church of the solid rock with high windows all decorated and pretty. They passed a restaurant with little round tables near the window. They came to a takeout shop and stood by the door a minute to smell the barbecue. "Sure would like to have some of that," whispered King. "Me too," whispered Tony, with his eyes closed. They walked slower down the street. The restaurant, the barbecue takeout place. Seems like they're getting hungry. Just after they passed some apartments, King Shabazz and Tony Polito came to a vacant lot. It was small and had high walls from apartments on 3 sides of it. 3 walls around it, and right in the middle, a car. It was beautiful. The wheels were gone, and so were the doors, but it was dark red and sitting high on a dirt mound in the middle of the lot. "Oh man, whispered King. "Oh man," whispered Tony. Then they heard the noise. Uh-oh. That does look cool, though, but what noise? It was a little long sound, like smooth things rubbing against rough, and it was coming from the car. It happened again. King looked at Tony and grabbed his hand. "Let's see what it is, man," he whispered. He thought Tony would say no and let's go home. Tony looked at King and held his hand tightly. "Right," he said very slowly. The boys stood there a minute, then began tiptoeing over toward the car. They walked very slowly across the lot. When they were halfway to the car, Tony tripped and almost fell. He looked down and saw a patch of little yellow pointy flowers growing in the middle of short spiky green leaves. "Man, I think you tripped on those crops," King laughed. "They're coming up," Tony shouted. "Man, the crops are coming up." Wow. Look at that. And just as Tony was making all that noise, they heard another noise, like a lot of things waving in the air. And they looked over at the car, and 3 birds flew out of one of the door holes and up to the wall of the apartment. What was that? Let's find out. King and Tony ran over to the car to see where the birds had been. They had to climb up a little to get to the door and look in. They stood there looking a long time without saying anything. There, on the front seat, in a whole lot of cottony stuff, was a nest. There, in the nest, were 4 light blue eggs. Blue. King took off his shades. "Man, it's spring," he said, almost to himself. Wow. "Anthony Polito!" King and Tony jumped down off the mound. Somebody was shouting for Tony as loud as he could. "Anthony Polito!" The boys turned and started walking out of the vacant lot. Tony's brother Sam was standing at the edge of the lot looking mad. "Ma's gonna kill you after I get finished, you squirt," he hollered. King Shabazz looked at Tony Polito and took his hand. "Spring is here," he whispered to Tony. "Right," whispered Tony Polito back. He found it. He found spring. That was awesome. The boy who didn't believe in spring found it, and now he knows. This book is pretty special because my mother read this book to me when I was very little. And actually, this book came out a long, long, long time ago. That's why the pictures looked like there were like old cars and old-fashioned buses. And this book was written in 1973 by Lucille Clifton. I was born a year later in 1974. And when I was little, maybe about 3 years old, my mother used to take me to the library all the time, and I fell in love with books. And this was one of the books that she read to me. And Lucille Clifton wrote this book and many other books that we read together. And I really fell in love with stories because of that. So that book is very special to me, and I hope you enjoyed the story as much as I did, especially the part at the end when they discovered that, yeah, sometimes you can believe in things that you've never really had any hope in, but there it is, right there. Such a beautiful story. Get this book at your library, The Boy Who Didn't Believe in Spring, or you can buy your own, like I did. I bought this book. All right, everybody, I will be back next week with another special book to share. I'm doing a countdown. It's almost my birthday. I will be 50 years old this year. That's a long time. All right, I'll see you next week with another wonderful story. Bye.